So welcome to you all. Today's program is planned to be 90 minutes. That will include a substantial amount, I think, of conversation, Q&A, conversation about the poems amongst yourselves. We're very interested in your feedback on this event, and so we'll save about 5 minutes at the end for you to respond to a short questionnaire, which, if you swiped in, will be in your phone by the end of the event. How cool is that? So now I'd like to introduce our two guests today. Matthew Zapruder is an associate professor in English and in the MFA Creative Writing program. He's also the editor-at-large for Wave Books, a press that he co-founded. And he was last year, or for a year, the poetry editor of the New York Times Magazine. Matthew's 4 collections of poetry include Sun Bear, Come On All You Ghosts, The Pajamaist, and American Linden. His work has been recognized with a Guggenheim Fellowship, Lannan Foundation Residency Fellowship, the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America, and the May Sarton Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, amongst others. In 2017, he published Why Poetry, a book of prose on poetry, and he'll be sharing some ideas from this work today. Brenda Hillman is a professor of creative writing at St. Mary's, where she holds the Olivia Filippi Chair in Poetry. She's the author of over 10 books of poetry and has received numerous awards for her work, including fellowships from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, Poetry Society of America, as well as a Pushcart Prize and the Delmore Schwartz Memorial Award. Her collection, Bright Existence, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Loose Sugar was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And that's just sort of off the top here. Both of them have much recognition from many other entities. Brenda's most recent collection, Extra Hidden Life Among the Days, has not left my nightstand since I bought my own copy last summer. I'm hoping to find out today why I find it both so painful and so comforting. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to the seminar program and to the Art Museum so much for sponsoring this. We requested mics, but there was some little mix-up about it, and I'm not a performing arts person, so I'm hoping if I speak at this level, because I don't want to blow out my voice. Some of my graduate students are here, so we have lots of activity in our voices the rest of the day. But I'll tell you that the event came about a little bit. Matthew was going to do an event about how to read a poem connected with his great book, and I'm holding it up. So if you don't have your copy, I know my English 102 people have it, but it is now in paperback, and it's an amazing book. And some of the people who have been in my classes know that I swear by this book. So some of the great wisdom that we'll hear today is going to be, you can actually read Matthew's paragraphs, and I'm hoping he's going to talk a little bit about it. But anyway, he was going to talk about it, and then it turned into a kind of a dual event. And then we chose poems together in connection with the seminar curriculum, but also adding 2 poems that we are in love with from writers that we love. And so in a way, they're kind of pairings, these poems. So we have Blake's London and a wonderful poem called Urban Nature by Ed Roberson. And then Ozymandias, which is a classic poem, and then a more contemporary poem by Barbara Guest, who's a very great experimentalist writer. And so I think those are kind of the pairings that we were thinking about. And I guess my little intro, just to keep it really brief, is just that you're all aware, and probably part of the reason you're here, that poetry is both exalted and also maligned in our culture. That people, like I walked into Safeway yesterday and you see poetry of food, you know, or poetry in bloom over the flower arrangements. Like, they use poetry, the poetry of soccer, the poetry of this, the poetry of that, as like the highest exemplar of beauty and the essence of the soul. And yet at the same time, people, I don't want to use the S word, people are not favorable. Well, I decided
Susan
I
Collins.
don't want.
Is that the
Yes,
S word?
Susan. At the same time, we actually don't honor poetry in our culture the way we choose to use it and abuse it. Like there's a whole thing on KQED now about great American reads. And so the Great American Reads are having hundreds and thousands of Americans send in their favorite novel suggestion. It's really supposed to be about your favorite book. There's not one acknowledgement that poetry was completely left out of the fact that these 100 great books might include one book of poetry for some Americans. So the fact that it's both exalted and also maligned is a real schism that we all experience. And I think Matthew captures a lot of this in his book. Like, why do we find it so mystifying, yet we all secretly love it, and we secretly start with it, and we not so secretly need it at our weddings, at our funerals, whenever a high moment comes up, or the Twin Towers get bombed, they call me and my husband and me up on like, can you give us a poem for this occasion? You know, and so there's always this twin experience of loving and hating it and fearing it. And so that's the culture we find ourselves in. And we when I first started teaching at St. Mary's, you couldn't fill a creative writing class, and now we have long waiting lists for our creative writing classes. So we know that students now are coming to creative writing as part of spiritual search that we all need so deeply in our lives, like how to express the anguish and the pleasure and the amazingness of our human experience, and in this perilous time. So it's a very interesting and amazing moment, and it's an amazing moment at St. Mary's too, where we used to not have much of a creative writing poetry culture, and now look at the room, you know, it's filled. So I'm really proud of the progress we've made as a culture here on campus in that direction. So, and thanks to Rebecca so much for helping with it. When performing arts, it's really helped too. So anyway, and then, you know, we thought we'd each just say a little thing, so that's my little thing, and then we'll just dive into the poems.
I just want to say to people who are back there, I mean, if you feel like you want to stay back there, that's fine, but you can come sit down if you don't want to be standing up.
Yeah,
we don't have the loudest voices, so you might not be able to hear us. But anyway, thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks, yes, Rebecca, for setting up this event, and thanks to the art gallery, this beautiful space. It's just a wonderful place to be, and it's so nice to see all of your faces. I've been on sabbatical this year, so I forgot what people look like, who aren't in my immediate family, and so it's nice to, it's good to be back in the community again, yeah. So thanks to Brenda for doing this. She kind of made it sound like it was going to be my thing, and she, you know, snuck in, but in fact, I was hopeful for and grateful for her participation, because I think a conversation is more interesting always than a monologue, and I hope that this will be a conversation. And thanks to Brenda also for your kind words about the book. The book's called Why Poetry, and it was written really out of an impulse to try to address some of the issues that Brenda so eloquently raised about, you know, anybody who's a poet knows that sooner or later you're going to run into somebody who's going to tell you like that they don't understand it, and sort of confess it like you're some priest or something, and they tell you that they're so sorry they don't get it. And there's a kind of double-edged sword of both with that respect, but also integration And I had a lot of those encounters in my life as a poet, especially after I published a book or two. And at first they annoyed me, but then I started to think that there must be something there. And so I started to write, and then what came out of that impulse to try to directly address those questions of why people feel like they don't understand poetry was this book. And so it seemed like a natural thing to do to try to bring that into our community, because students, you know, in seminar and other places, periodically will come across a poem. Faculty members who might not be specialists in literature will periodically have the teaching of a poem imposed on them. And so it seems like this is a natural place to talk about these issues and to just sort of get into the basics of it. I don't want to talk much more other than just to say that other than things like buying new running shoes and you know, organizing my spice rack and stuff during sabbatical, I also wrote a teacher's guide for this book, Why Poetry. I in fact organize my spice rack actually. But not alphabetically, but just like by use, like some of the ones that I use more anyway. But the teacher's guide, which is up here, kind of lays out this plan of how I sort of try to, I don't know, is it inductive or deductive reasoning when you go from your experience? I don't know which one it is. Inductive reasoning. So, I try to abstract. I guess I'm not ready for integral. So I try to abstract from my own experience and also from just a lot of the experience I have with other people reading poetry, what it is that I think people are doing when they read poems, and then to kind of turn that into a simple method that can then be articulated both to readers and to teachers. And so I have a kind of steps of dealing with it, and there's certainly not, I think there are things that anybody who teaches a lot of poetry, reads a lot of poetry, be like, oh yeah, of course I do that naturally, but it was kind of interesting to just sort of write them down in that way. So that's what the teacher's guide is. And do you think we should just start with the poems, or should I say a little bit about that? Or?
Well,
maybe we can just get into the poems.
Yeah, just tagging off of that, I do want to say that when I've taught Matthew's book and then using it in my classes, one of the things that is very illuminating, and it's certainly the most obvious thing you're going to ever hear, but it's something you haven't actually it's never sort of penetrated your consciousness about reading poetry, which is Matthew's book teaches students to read what's on the page first and actually go to what's on the page instead of like, oh, there's this smoky, mysterious aura over this because it's a poem and it's going to automatically be a riddle, an unbelievably difficult piece of language that I'm going to have trouble with, and maybe there's a right and wrong, and if I don't get the metaphor, I'm not going to get a good grade.
And some of the words mean what they say, some other words mean some other symbolic thing that I don't know what it is, and maybe the teacher knew or maybe the poet knew, and I have to guess what that secret code is of some of the words, but I'm not sure which ones. So I could kind of make it hard.
And
also.
There's only one answer to the secret code.
Right.
And so if people just keep like trying in class to provide the various things, then at some point the teacher will look pleased and give like a broad smile of like,
yeah, and also that there's this big message to poems. Always, every single poem is really about some big, huge moral issue, which usually turns out to be the most banal possible statement, like death is sad, or like nature is good, or don't hurt other people, or stuff like that. That's like supposedly poets are sitting there like, how can I say the dumbest possible, most obvious thing in the most complicated way? Sometimes I'll say to my students that a riddle is the opposite of a poem. So a riddle is something incredibly obvious. It's said in the most complicated way possible. In order to supposedly, it's fun to try to figure it out, right? Mm-hmm. Like what's red and white and black all over, or whatever, like penguin in the blood. But a poem is the opposite. A poem is something that's very elusive. But maybe the poet doesn't quite know or understand that the poet is reaching for in the poem to make or articulate or turn into language somehow, but never doing anything to deliberately make it more distant from themselves or the reader. It's just that sometimes poems are strange or complicated because life is strange and complicated. And so not everything is, as straightforward as, some very simple statement. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And so we shouldn't assume that everything unfamiliar is just there to hide something really obvious.
Yeah, so just again, just going first to the words on the page, and trusting your experience, and not fearing your experience. And if it seems that you're that it's slightly impenetrable at first, we'll go with that and start reading, and just go word by word and sentence by sentence, line by line, in that way.
And
So
that you can do it.
that you can do it, and
Completely capable of it.
and that it's that not only are there different degrees of mystery in your life and in your experience. Obviously, some things are on the surface and some things are invisible, and that's certainly true in poetry too. But that keeping the pleasure that was removed from you in 4th grade, I think, is the main thing that you can possibly do for yourself when you're trying to read or write poetry. Keeping it pleasurable for you to be. We talked yesterday in English 102 about reading John Ashbery, because we were reading Matthew's chapter on Ashbery, and we were talking about like our first experience of ice skating, and somebody talked about falling on his ass. Like you're ice skating, you're gonna fall, and so you just slide with it. And certainly there are lots of poems like Ashbery's poetry that you're just not going to be able to like pick the theme that you can then raise your hand and make your teacher happy right away. Oh yeah, she got it.
Yeah. And I guess, just the last thing I'll say, and then I think we should get into the poems, is it seems maybe natural to just mention that my reading method, trademark, has 4 stages to it, and the first 2 stages are kind of what we're talking about. The first one is really to stick as closely as possible with what's on the page, because that's pleasurable and interesting, and the poets have made those choices. There's poets, I know poets in this room, and I know they think very hard about the choices they make in their poems, and so we should, as readers, respond with equal attention to those choices. And then the second thing is to notice what seems strange or weird or odd or off or maybe exciting, or whatever word you want to use for it in the poem, the thing you don't understand or you don't get, and to just point to it and start asking questions and talking about that, because that's where the poem is the most itself. That's where and we'll see that in the readings that we're going to do. It's always true. The thing that's strangest, and so you can turn that fear or that resentment that it's not what you expect it to be into, that's the same thing as critical intelligence. That's the thing. That's your mind observing something useful about the poem. So it's not a failure if you look at something and say, I don't understand this, or why is it this way, or why is this weird thing? That's your intelligence kicking in. And so if you could just perform that mental, does that make sense what I'm saying? If you can perform that mental operation on yourself instead of condemning yourself for not knowing everything, praising yourself for identifying something interesting. So let's try to do that with these poems, again, see maybe in practice.
And you want to talk about the other 2 steps later.
We'll get to that later, yeah, but this is, yeah.
So we'll start with London, which is a great poem that you will use all your life and remember all your life once you read it with any kind of attention. And can we have maybe a couple people read this? Somebody with a booming voice. Do you have
Terry,
a booming
can you read it?
Okay.
You have a great reading voice.
And then this young man.
Yeah, and then the
Yeah.
How much are you reading?
You're reading
Just the poem.
London.
Just the whole poem.
Okay.
You have to read the title.
I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blast a newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage curse.
Okay, and maybe, did you want to read too? Do you have a booming voice?
I have a booming.
You do?
Boom
Okay,
away.
so you, yeah, boom.
Boom away.
Boom, so.
Thank you. Please do read the title too, please.
So Ozymandias?
No, London.
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 Yeah.
Okay. I wonder.
I'm sorry. Please read the title.
Oh, London, sorry, by William Blake. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice and every band, the mine-ford manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was very moving.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, Stella, thank you. So let's go first to the obvious. And, again, in English 102, we always describe without evaluating for our first few comments, or we try to. So by description, we mean describe without saying, like, I like how so-and-so happens. Okay, so just describe, what
We
are
can
the
even
things
start
you
with an
obviously-
easier question. Why did I insist that both people read the title in Palm? Why did I say that? I wanted that as part of the experience, do you think? Not a trick question.
Visualization. Visualization.
Sure, but,
Hand over here.
Oh,
yeah,
It helps give a little bit of context to the rest of the poem.
helps.
give a little, like what
context.
sort of context?
Like, just give like a general idea of what the poem will talk about.
Which is what?
London.
Yes,
London.
thank you. So the poem takes place in London,
It's not
London, England.
San Francisco.
Right,
It's-
or heaven, or
Right.
my grandmother's basement. It's London.
Right, so
That's like super important to the poem.
Yeah, that really.
Right?
So
I mean, it seems to
titles
me, right.
matter, okay? There may be a great contrast between the title and the body of the poem, or the title and the first line, and we always talk about like the gap between the title and the first
Yeah.
line. Maybe there's a tremendous ironic gap, and then in postmodern writing, it'll be titled, London, and then there'll be some description of,
That'll be in French.
a supermarket or something. So you don't really make the match up the way you should, or the way you can, but there's an ironic gap. But in this case, it's evidently we're going to be taken right into a description of a city, right?
And this is London. I mean, William Blake wrote, in the early.
So he's born in 1757, so he's very, very much he's the first sort of official British Romantic poet who's usually included in the anthologies. So he's,
So this isn't London. This isn't 21st century London. This is old timey
This
London.
is 18th century London.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So those things they help, I think, if you read the poem, knowing
That
where and when it
matters,
is.
right.
Basically, I think, right? Doesn't that help a little bit?
So,
Okay.
yeah, but you don't know when you're just actually looking on the page, if you don't get out your phone or don't Google or whatever, you don't know exactly when this was written, so you're just working with the text right away. So, what are other surface things that you notice about the poem? Just surface.
No
first thing.
wrong answers.
Yeah.
It seems very Dickinsonian.
Dickinsonian. How so? This person said it seems Dickinsonian. Why do you mean? Do you mean Dickensian, or do you?
I meant like Charles Dickens.
Oh, Charles Dickens. So Dickensian. Okay, yeah. But it's also a bit Dickinsonian as well. But yeah.
I couldn't figure out the acronym.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. And so what? Why do you say that?
I mean, it just says. It talks about the urban conditions and the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has Dickensian description. Yeah.
Um,
Charles Dickens wrote a lot about urban urban landscapes and urban distress too,
Yeah.
right?
Poor people.
If we're just not even referencing, what do you see though? What's the shape of the poem? You know, what are the little boxes called when poetry is in these little boxes with gaps between them? Stanzas. What does stanza mean? Means room in Italian. So these little rooms, these little stanzas, it's really nice to have these little rooms because they usually are units for some reason. And very often, so you have these little rooms, these little stanzas. In this case, what do they sound like? They have a rhyme scheme, right? What is the rhyme scheme? A, B, A, B, right. So it rhymes in a very orderly way, right? And then it goes C, D, C, D.
So when I read a poem, usually what happens to me is the first time I kind of don't really get it. I read it and I maybe pick up 10% of it. So then I read it again and I really try to think about what's actually happening. And so in this poem I read London. So I know I'm in London. I think I'm in London, or probably going to be in London. I mean, maybe not. Could be somewhere else, but odds are London, right? And then I wander through each chartered street. What is happening? What's happening there? This is not a trick question. What's going on?
It's literally walking through the city.
Somebody's walking through the city, right? And is there anything odd about that line for anybody that jumps out at anyone that's unusual? Chartered, right? Somebody said chartered over there, I think.
I said the meter.
The meter. I wander through each chartered street, so definitely wander through each chartered street. There's 4 stresses, right? But Matthew's question about what's odd about it, some people said chartered, right? Why is that odd?
I think that's a good observation. That's a word that jumps out to me too in that line, because it could just be I wander through each street, or I wander through each darkened street, or I wander through each dirty street, or whatever, something that we've all seen before. But the word chartered is a little unusual, right? I think something you might even have to look up. It's interesting. So, and it turns out, there's no reason anybody in this room would know what that refers to without looking it up, so you shouldn't feel bad that you don't know. But does anybody know what that refers to? Why? Chartered? Yeah.
Does it mean kind of he already knows the streets, or they've been mapped out?
It does have to do with mapping. So in England, and you would notice if you looked it up, it's not hard to find this out. In England, they divided up the city into charters, and it basically means that all the land has been given for ownership to rich people. So that everything is chartered. It's all been doled out to the wealthy. So he's conscious of that as he's walking through the street. He's walking through owned streets. He's walking through streets that are governmentally allotted to the wealthy. Right? And then he says, near where the chartered Thames does flow. So even the river has been divided and given away. Right? So that's what I mean about taking something that's unusual, that word chartered, and trying to, now I took away, as we say in child rearing, I stole your struggle. I took away the interpretation and did it myself, just to give you an example of what I mean about finding something strange. Do you see what I mean though about that? It's not like a secret code type thing. It's just a matter of just of investigating that word in a dictionary.
Just sticking with the word.
Yeah.
And even more strange in the second degree of strangeness is that when Matthew reads the second line, and it's a very famous thing about this poem, is that he uses chartered a second time.
Yep.
And in a creative writing class, you might say, you just used this word. So you might want to change it to, darkened or another word in the second line. But why does he repeat it? It's a very short poem. Why would he want to use chartered twice, especially with that apostrophe? Yes.
I think chartered, I think can it like also mean essentially like you're like frightened or unsettling?
Unsettling?
Yeah,
I don't know that.
I just checked I just checked the word in the dictionary and
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's so essentially this London in this whole poem is dirty, not just in texture, but in well conscience.
Uh-huh.
Spiritually, yeah.
Yeah, good,
For sure.
good point, good reading, yeah.
Like this was, I think this was done about the time of the French Revolution. I mean, Tale of Two Cities.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is yeah, the same kind of
Yeah, so he's saying something about the relationship between the law and the geography and the ownership, right? And all bundled up in that one little word, which in case you didn't hear it the first time, he says it the second time, like, things are owned, not by me, but by them. We're wandering through these chartered streets near where the chartered Thames does flow. How do you divide up a river? Like the salmon don't know that there aren't any salmon in the Thames, by the way. But there are salmon in our rivers. So how do you divide up a river? But he's making this big statement about how we own the earth in these little increments, all by repeating the word chartered. So
also just thinking when you mentioned like the salmon don't know what owns it. The only thing that matters is that are there any fish still alive in the Thames? I mean, because if it's chartered and blackened like everything else in London, then
I do not. The question was, and I don't know. I think the
Can we
video
just
is
have,
on.
if
Right?
you're on that side talking, can you speak so the people who are standing in the back here can
Yeah,
hear you?
so the question was, he didn't know whether there are any fish still in the Thames. I would
because
say I
it's
wouldn't.
so polluted that I mean, didn't they say
I wouldn't have done a lot of eating from the Thames.
Yeah, I don't think we
It's-
mostly
I mean,
eat
it
fish.
smells
from-
awful and like all of London, it's chartered, owned, and pretty badly polluted and blackened and
Yes.
corrupted.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
It's a poisoned city essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is where Blake is going.
What else do people notice about the poem that might seem odd, or that they just aren't, that you don't get, or something, or you don't really
Should we keep
get why it's that way?
going through the-
Sure, but
See
thought
if
I'd
he
ask.
repeats again in the third and fourth line of that first stanza. Mark and then mark again. So
Mhm.
there's kind of like
Right,
the first
so
he repeats charter and then he repeats.
do you want to shout for them? So she's saying that then there's another repetition in lines 3 and 4. And mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. There's a 3-time repetition, right? And how does that triadic repetition work? What does the first mark mean? If you mark, I marked that you were saying this. What is that? What part of speech is it?
That's a verb.
It's a verb. The graduate students know their parts of speech. So the first mark is like I marked that you were like smiling at me. I noticed. I remarked. I marked. So that's a verb. And then, what are the next 2 marks? What are they? Parts of speech. They're nouns. Yeah. So it's an interesting repetition.
Does everybody feel, the people in the room, the undergrads, or people who, do you all feel like you're tracking what's going on with this poem, or do you feel confused, like about what's going on? Because if you feel confused in any way, we should just stop and investigate that confusion. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
Well, that I can't help with.
Can we share it?
So,
We have-
does anybody have any questions so far about this person walking around in London and being kind of pissed off that it's a certain way and bummed out, basically? Seems like that's what's going on. Does that seem okay to everybody? Then the second stanza, he starts hearing things. So he sees things in the first stanza, right?
Right.
And then he starts hearing things, right? In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Band. Wasn't expecting that. Cry, voice, okay, those are things you hear. But what's a band? What's a band? What's that? Prohibition, yeah. Again, like seems governmental, right? Or religious maybe? Something you're not supposed to do, not supposed to feel, or a way you're not supposed to act. So somehow he's associating that banning, that saying of no to things with people's suffering, I guess, maybe.
Now, one question you might sort of feel, that at least it often comes up when you're reading a poem like this, like, why is he saying this? Or why did he decide to write this? It kind of doesn't matter what his mood was, or his life circumstance, or what his purpose was when we stick to what he's actually saying. You know, he's making a commentary about this city that is very difficult at a time when you wanted to sort of think cities were the place where we'd go to have a better life. But for William Blake at the end of the 18th century, so far after two stanzas, not so great, right? So that's one of the things about poetry, it's so compressed that already there's two stanzas of a whole worldview that have just shown you this whole thing.
But what about the last line of the second stanza? Does anybody want to take a crack at that? The mind-forged manacles I hear. Yes, and then McLean.
Could be referring to like poverty, because in the first stanza, talking about like chartered streets and chartered towns, how only the rich can really own anything and have like a place in London, and then talking about how every cry of every man and infant, that like perhaps it's those people who don't have a place and don't really have any hope of moving up.
Can I cross-examine you for a second?
Sure.
I'm going to treat you as a friendly witness. What are manacles?
It's like a chain.
A chain. Does everyone hear the
Manacles
question?
are handcuffs, right? So it's chain, yeah. It's something. So the mind-forged manacles. What does that mean? What does mind-forged manacles mean?
Well,
What are manacles? How are manacles usually forged?
How are they made?
What?
Metal.
Yeah, in a place where they make metal.
Foundry.
Foundry, yeah,
Yeah.
right? So what does mind-forged manacles mean?
like if these institutions that they have, like the chartering system and stuff like that, never existed, then these people wouldn't be in a position where they're in poverty. So
Yeah.
it's like just like an institution of the mind.
So he says he hears them in the cries, right? So how can you describe what he might be hearing? Like
despair, like people maybe thinking and realizing that they don't have any chance of escaping this.
yeah, which sounds to him like manacles, right? There's an actual physical. He's almost like hearing a kind of like clinking or clanking sound. It's like it's a metaphor, right? It's like so. But yeah, I think you're. But the reason why I wanted to dig into what you said is because I think you did something that really good students often do, which is that they'll jump to the conclusion, which is correct, but not take us through the way they got there, and the way like the close reading process of how you get there, which is interesting. So I agree 1,000% with your interpretation, but I kind of always want, and those of you who've been in my workshops have irritatingly experienced me doing this before, where I try to back people up and just go through slowly, like how did you get there, and like what did you see, and why did the word tell you this or whatever, because it's interesting. That line is very famous, the mind-forged manacles. That's like a very famous line of this poem, because it's kind of interesting. It's like this idea that the chains that hold us are made by the mind.
The mind.
And not by, it's, he, you know, I could have said different, yeah, there's a hand in the back there, yeah.
I was just gonna say, you sort of hit upon it at the end there. When I read that, I'm thinking maybe self-imposed. Like, whose mind created?
Yeah, that's the implication too. He said that the implication might be that it's self-imposed. And you said, I think, you were saying that that comes from somewhere else, which is also, I think, true in the poem too, but I think that the implication might be that mind forged manacles means maybe you're even doing it to yourself. You know, somehow, like there's a little bit of that implication, and that's an interesting thing to talk about.
But definitely that it's human. It's
Yeah.
not. You know, it's not Hurricane
Yeah,
Michael.
right.
It's well, that's maybe human caused too. But you know, it's not caused by God. It's caused by, you know, that humans are doing it.
And that what Brenda just said is a very, almost like contemporary idea that our consciousness is what keeps us from being free. That's not an idea that people had in like 1400. You know, necessarily. Maybe some people might have had it. Or yeah, Clayton and then Rebecca.
I think that line is kind of interesting because of this idea of like self-imposed kind of servitude or being a prisoner of your own making. It kind of like brings a complicity to the people. Like, here's these institutions that have like made it hard for you and imprisoned you, but you've just resigned yourself to them. So you're actually like complicit in it. You're your own like prison guard kind of thing.
That's really well said. Yeah.
So stepping back to be meta for a second, especially for seminar instructors, this is a place where I might stop and ask each of the students to talk about why it is that they're more drawn to an interpretation that this imprisonment would come from outside structures, and why some might be more drawn to an interpretation that it would come from one's own consciousness. That's an interesting thing to think about. You know, where does our lack of freedom come from? You know, and that's the idea I think this poem is starting to bring up. Yeah, Rebecca, you were saying.
Well, I was kind of in the both and with that. A wonderment that humans create things like charters
Mhm.
and bans and do this to themselves and to each other.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really, I mean, I think it is, it's open.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. Yeah.
And it's the end of the first two stanzas, you have a little manacle at work, you know. I've been arrested recently, and they use plastic Ziploc, which is always interesting because you not only can't get out of them, but they can't, you know, it's made of petroleum product. But anyway, that's just a little aside about manacles.
So we're spending a lot of time on this poem. Do you want to like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can keep going with this interpretation by the last line.
Yeah.
You know, you have even prostitute mothers are implicated in this terrible system of the city that has drawn all of humankind into infants, and the marriage vehicle has turned into also a death vehicle.
A marriage hearse, right?
At the
And it's
same
so
time.
easy, I think, when you read the poem sometimes to miss that. I mean, the first few readings I might miss that but then you're like, wait, marriage hearse?
Exactly.
That's not what it is.
But
Like,
it's
you know,
so memorable.
it is incredible, you know, right? Marriage should be marriage, what, carriage or
Yeah.
marriage carriage? Marriage limo, marriage limo. Like, although that turned into a hearse
Carriage?
recently too.
A marriage
yeah,
carriage.
carriage. That's really bad.
So maybe we want to do a more contemporary poem
Yeah.
that is going to now, you know, and we paired these, like there are two urban poems and there's two kind of imaginary poems.
Yeah.
So this, the one called Urban Nature, is kind of maybe related to, but also not related to. So maybe somebody wants to read by great poet Ed Roberson. He's a poet who writes about cities and nature. Sage, you want to read it?
Urban nature. I get you. Neither New Hampshire nor Midwestern farm, nor the summer home in some Hamptons garden thing, not that nature, not a sartorial leisure comes to terms peel by peel, not that core whiff of beauty as the spirit. Just a street pocket park, clean of any smells, simple quiet, not the same as no birds sing, definitely not the dead of no birds sing. The bus stop posture in the interval of nothing coming, a not quite here running sound underground, sidewalks great vibrationless in open voice, sweet berries ripen in the street hawks kiosks. The orange is being flown in this very moment, picked of its origin.
Okay.
That snaps.
One more person read it. Maybe somebody on that side? Do you have it? Who has it over there?
You want to read it? You stand up so people can hear you.
For maximum embarrassment? No, no.
Of course, of course. Just be loud.
Urban nature. Neither New Hampshire nor Midwestern farm, nor the summer home in some Hamptons gardens thing, not that nature, not a sartorial leisure comes to terms peel by peel, not that core whiff of beauty as the spirit. Just a street pocket park, clean of any smells, simple quiet, not the same thing as no birds, not the same as no birds sing, definitely not the dead of no birds sing. The bus stop posture in the interval of nothing coming, a not quite here running sound underground, sidewalks great vibrationless and open voice, sweet berries ripen in the street hawk's kiosk. The orange is being flown in this very moment, picked at its origin.
Okay, very good. So what, your first take here, what's the title?
Urban nature.
Urban nature, yeah. So it's like London.
Can I tell you all a little secret about poetry? A lot of the time, the title, if you just put the word in is after it, that really helps because a lot of the time the poem just addresses or defines or elaborates on the title. Not always. That does not always work. But it worked in London and it works in this poem. Is or are, maybe it's you know, right? So it's something, if you're completely baffled by the title and first line, just try that. Try to think of it almost like a definition, like the title and then the poem is a kind of idiosyncratic definition of that term. Again, it doesn't always work, it's not always that way, but it can often be that way. So and it is in this case.
So if we use the title, so Ed Roberson, he's a contemporary experimentalist, African-American poet. He's very well known for this amazing book called City Eclogues. And he kind of he's radicalized the idea of the urban nature poem in some way, which you obviously don't need to know to read this poem. But I thought to save time, I'd say that. So what's the first? We did the first line in the London poem. What's the first thing you?
Can we ask about the title too?
Oh, yeah. You want to talk?
Well, I
about
just
that?
wanted to know if anybody had any thoughts about that, urban nature. Is that, what do you all think about that even before we get into the poem itself? Like, does that strike anybody's odd or?
What?
Urban, you don't really associate nature in urban areas.
No, you don't. You don't really. She said you don't really associate urban nature as. It seems like an oxymoron,
It's an oxymoron, right? Or not really, but it's,
They're colliding.
on the surface it seems like an
Yeah.
oxymoron. It is in
That's-
fact, but yeah, you have your hand up.
I'm wondering if it's trying to, if it's using the word nature as a way to describe urban, and then like this is like the nature of urban.
Urban nature. That's so good. God, you're smart. Okay, so I did not know that about this poem until you just said that thing. What she said is, and this is 1,000% her idea and 0% mine, is that it's not only urban nature like the oxymoron, but it's the nature of urbanness, urban nature. You know, so it's going to describe what sort of it means for something to be urban. So there's already multiple ideas in the title, and that was a really smart thing to say about this poem.
And so if we went to
So-
our old model of like, what does the teacher think is the right answer, or what is the right answer because the author intended it, the answer to that is neither, or neither and both, because the word nature holds both the idea of the nature of something and our cliche idea that it's only trees and birds outside of cities, right? So this is kind of taking both of those. So what about that first line? If we do the first few lines of this, the way we did the first few lines, first of all, how many lines in the poem? How many lines in the poem? Do a quick count.
14.
What does that mean it is?
Sonnet.
Yes, it is. Even if it doesn't rhyme, if you see 14, you automatically just go like, so it just goes in your mind like to sonnet, and you can just say that. Okay, so what about the first few lines of it that you notice? Yeah, Rachel.
So I think that the first three kind of set up for us that nature is not this specific thing, so there's almost a setup for a kind of definition that is going to follow of what constitutes nature. So it's saying it's not in the Midwest, it's not the Hampton Gardens, it's going to be something other.
So did everyone on that side hear that it's the first three lines kind of set up this sort of weird anti-definition? It's neither, it's not, it's not. So it's a definition, you know, already we're in a very, what Matthew's talking about, the odd territory. Like, what's the oddness of this first experience of this? Well,
Right.
the oddness is like, it's not this.
Well, so you would expect someone, if I said to you, Terry, tell me what you think about nature in cities. You might expect the answer to come back as some statements like, well, it's this, or it makes me think of that, or I think it's this, or whatever. But this poet chooses to, in a way, back into it by saying what it's not, which is a very typical technique in poetry. Negation. You'll see it over and over again in poetry. So, like Rachel so correctly said, it starts to define what urban nature is by saying what it isn't. It's not the thing you would usually expect. I'm from the East Coast, and when somebody says New Hampshire, I think about mountains and nature. You know, white mountains, nature, all this stuff, whatever. And so he's saying it's not that. Nor Midwest, those big farms in the Midwest, that's not nature either. Nor it's this, and this is a funny thing that he does here, nor the summer home in some Hamptons. So you might not know what the Hamptons are here on the West Coast, but it's this fancy schmancy place that rich people summer in on Long Island. It's like where rich people go to with their big houses in Long Island. So it's not that either. It's not a summer home in some Hamptons garden thing. Like he doesn't even know he doesn't even know like what he's talking about basically. He's like some thing in some place where rich people go. Right? So that's does everybody see how he's getting into the
Not
poem?
that nature.
Right.
Not that
That's not
capital nature.
Not that nature, capital N nature. Yeah,
Not a Satori. And what is
right.
Satori?
Okay. This is a big
This is
poem,
the cool.
right?
This is a cool thing that he does. What does Satori mean? Does anybody know? So if you were on your own, you'd want to
Time out. You gotta it's fine now, but this is why I'm in half of my book is about how you have to have dictionaries when you read poems because it's because nobody knows what all the words mean. And dictionaries are amazing tools, and so they're
And they're not just found here.
Right.
They actually are on paper too. So one of the coolest things in the world is the American Heritage Dictionary, which our bookstore sells. And in the back of the American Heritage Dictionary, there's this cool 50-page thing of the roots of the language. It's the most exciting thing you'll ever read, really.
The great thing about old dictionaries too, by the way, so old dictionaries used to be often the only book that people would have in their house, or they had very few books in their house, and they were extremely expensive. And we're talking about 50, 75 years ago. You know, maybe people would have some books, but they'd have a dictionary, and it was an expensive purchase. So it couldn't just be all those definitions of words. Often it would have a lot of supplementary material, such as like the best way to make a fire in a fireplace, how to write a business letter, what the proper attire is to a funeral, like all kinds of things. So old dictionaries are amazing because there are these little cultural snapshots. You can go and see all these like really weird ideas people had about how to live. And so I recommend that if you have, like if your parents have an old dictionary or grandparents or whatever, don't get rid of it. Just look in the back of it and see all the weird, cool stuff that's in there.
But we know we haven't convinced you not to use this, so did you just look up Satori? What did you find out?
That it has to do with enlightenment.
It's definitely, it's a Japanese based spiritual term for enlightenment. So Satori is, we all talk about enlightenment or nirvana or something like that, but Satori is another concept that's Japanese based. And so, but he breaks this invented word that sartorial. Does anyone know what sartorial means? That's the word that we kind of expect. What does that refer to?
Like when you see those French paintings where people are like in a swing and they're dressed in like silk, but they're like in the nature scene. I don't know. Like
Sartorial,
clothes?
kind of related to that, but sartorial has to do with like your choice of clothes.
It's just the adjective for clothing.
I am always talking to my husband about like your sartorial choice today, and we always both laugh because it's my euphemism of saying like, change your shirt. You know, but sartorial, it refers to your to clothing,
Fancy word for
So
clothing.
he's punning. So he's inventing a word and then also breaking it, which is an especially something I love.
And
about
why would he break it? Does anybody have any thoughts about why he might break the word? I mean, it's free verse, so he could.
Satori.
Right, I know, but I'm just asking.
Asking.
I feel like it calls attention to it, because like when I was reading it, I was
Yeah.
like, oh, there's a break here, and now it's something else.
Yeah.
So it calls your attention to it, so you're forced into this kind of multiplicity of definitions.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah, it's not that line break. I think it stops you a little bit.
So just to go back to where we started, like with Matthew's 4 degrees, and it's like the 4 stages of grief, but the 4 stages of pleasure of poetry. So we're in the first 2 stages still, where the more we know about the word Satori and how he broke it, and sartorial and how he's punning on that, our appreciation deepens. But we don't have to have the appreciation for the whole thing. The more we read this poem, now we know, oh yeah, he built this little magical machine out of breaking sartorial in half, and then he made it into satorial to make a little pun that's his little inside joke, but then you can kind of keep reading. And you get more pleasure the more you read and understand, but you don't have to start with all the knowledge to get some of the pleasure. That's the point. Like you can love this poem, and you can even like not even notice that it was a sonnet, and then suddenly like, oh, you wake up, oh, there's 14 lines, I wonder, and he broke it after 8 lines, which there's a volta in the sonnet.
It's always better to read in a group of people too, because everybody knows something about something.
Right.
But somebody in your group might know what the word sartorial is, or might know something about Satori, or might know something about this or that or whatever. So together in conversation and in pointing to the things you don't know, you bring out the things that other people do know.
So
Which is also really great too, because like in a class, one thing I really love is that you find out things about people that you wouldn't otherwise know. Like somebody will launch into a long explanation of Zen enlightenment, and you're like, I thought you were like the dumb like soccer kid, you know? No, I'm just kidding. No, I thought like, I'm just joking. Like no, I thought like, you know, I thought you were like the violin expert or something. How did you know about like or the like, you know, or the you know, whatever, like the painter or something. And look at that, you know, all about this other stuff. It's always like that. People always have hidden depths.
Collective
And the things that
knowledge.
the surface ways we see each other are always wrong. And so that's the thing I love about talking about poems with students is like how they, you know, will reveal themselves and all the knowledge they have and all their life experience, which is so cool.
So maybe, I don't know if we have time to do, maybe we don't have time to do another one, or if you have questions about this poem, maybe that'd be worthwhile.
Or about
Just maybe we'll do 10 more minutes and just do questions. Yeah.
So one question I have, kind of along the same lines as William's, because it happens in the next few lines, the chord of the first
you repeat what he said?
I didn't hear it.
You're talking about the line
Why
break
he decides to divide the line.
after just a street pocket park.
Yeah.
So the thing about the ends of lines are, if something is broken kind of against the grammatical expectation at a line, at the end, a line ending, or a line break, it's sometimes called. I always think of Galway Canal saying lines, there's no such thing as a line break, lines are whole, which is interesting, but we call them line breaks very often. So how a poet decides to end a line where she or he does, in this case, just a street pocket park. So that is called an enjambment when it's done very suddenly or against the grammatical expectation. So why didn't he leave street pocket park? Because this is not a rhymed sonnet. There's no reason he would get an extra charge out of ending with that street. But there are some end rhymes that are a little bit off rhymes. Farm, garden, sing. But he gets an additional meaning, or he gets an additional charge out of ending with street, then going over to the next line that he wouldn't necessarily get if he kept it all on one line. Just a street pocket park. You're reading it. You can read it several ways.
There are some things that happen in poems that can't be explained in words. They make a spiritual music. They are correct or right, or they have an effect that cannot be translated into language accurately. And that's a kind of both frustrating and exhilarating thing about studying literature in a classroom. There's a limit to what can be said, and at a certain point, I think, and I'm basing this on my own practice as a poet, there are some times when you just know the line break is in the right place because it sounds right to you and it feels right to you in your body, and that's why it's there. And there's no reason that's intellectual. It doesn't have to do with like a meaning-making thing. So I think that sometimes it's a job of teachers to protect that space too for art, to say, we've gotten up to maybe the place where these things can be talked about in that way, and now we're in a different kind of zone of talking about very subjective things, which is also fine. Like, how does it make you feel when this happens, or what does it make you think of? And so just coming back a little bit to touch base with my 4 stages of pleasure, and the 4th stage of it is to realize that there are many more stages than 4 stages. But it's the subsequent, the first 2 are about really close reading the text, and then the next 2 are more about leaving the text and thinking about one's own ideas and associations, because what poems really are is, like Brenda used the word machines. They're, we're surrounded by paintings too, right? And like, when you experience a piece of art, the real desire on the part of the artist, I think, is to change you. It's to interact with you as a viewer, you as a listener, you as a reader, and to change you, and to cause you to think about your own life, and to think about things differently. So if a work of art is really having an effect, it will become personal to you at a certain point. But you just have to understand that that without some time with the poem as it is on the page or with the artwork, that you'll just always stay in the same place as a person. You won't really be changed. Do you all see what I'm saying? You can't immediately jump to this makes me think of this, or I think this is about this thing or whatever, which has nothing to do with the actual poem, because then you won't really be being changed. You'll just be reiterating things you already know. But if you allow yourself to really experience the poem or experience the painting or experience whatever it is, then you will truly be changed, and then you can talk about the new ideas you have, whether or not they're present in the poem.
And that's really great too. Great. Back to the initial point, which is that it's not about searching out a theme or like the answer to the riddle or anything like that. It's about having something that you can take away that corresponds to your own experience, that seems to you absolutely new and fresh. For me, this poem, I remember reading it right before my husband and I went to Berlin, and in Berlin there are all these like little city parks that are absolutely jewel-like in Berlin, and you know the Germans just really value having these little city parks, and they're all buried, and you experience urban nature in these little pockets. And I remember calling up this poem when we were there and thinking, like, just a street pocket park, clean of any smells, simple, quiet, not the same as No Birds Sing, definitely not the dead of No Birds Sing.
Now,
It's so cool.
that's a reference to, you don't need to know this to read this poem, okay? So I don't want to get into this, back our way into the annoying thing that there's always something outside the text. But that is a reference to a famous poem by John Keats called La Belle Dame sans Merci, which is, the sedge is withered in the lake and no birds sing. That's a quote from a poem. It doesn't matter. You can have a completely immense experience with this poem without ever knowing that, but I just thought I would mention that since it's what can ail the united arms alone and palely loitering, the sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing. That's the quote. But it doesn't matter because me personally, the beginning of that second stanza is is my favorite part of the whole poem when he's saying this is what urban nature is. It's the bus stop posture in the interval of nothing coming. It's the way people stand at the bus stop when they're waiting for the bus. That's urban nature.
Yeah.
I love that moment because it has something to do with what we ordinarily think of as nature. It's like the human response to the environment, the unconscious human response to the environment. You know, it's so cool. Like, what a cool idea. To
And
think
the
that
orange
that's
being
nature.
flown in.
Yeah,
you
which
know?
is kind of horrible, right, in a way, because that's economically and environmentally problematic. All this flying around of produce, so we can experience it, but it's also kind of exciting because then you can have your orange.
Well, it's a very undespairing poem, in kind of hand in hand with the William Blake, which oddly enough we have even more cause to despair with yesterday's environmental report, which if our federal government doesn't take it seriously, we're in real trouble. But yesterday's environmental report was like the Declaration of Independence. It was that important. So if you don't know about it yet, you should go read it. But just the idea that we have some cause for not despairing about human experience in this very tightly constructed, beautiful urban nature poem, and then Blake, who saw the beginning of it 250 years ago. So we should probably turn it over for a few last questions, and if you have any things that you're wondering about that we haven't opened up for you here or given you permission to be confused about. Does anybody else,
Yes.
big or little? Yeah.
So my question, I don't have a training in how to read poems, but when there's a poem, these poems have words we know and structures we know. But if you come across a poem that just like kind of defies all that, and like you recognize the words, but the way they're arranged doesn't make sense, like there's no images coming to you. What do you do with a poem that's like super complex and open?
Super. So the question was, what do you do with the maybe contemporary poems that are super complex, where you may know the words on the surface, but you're just thinking the experience is not even, you can't even parse it together. I'd say the same experience still holds. Just start from reading what's on the page. Start with your experience of sounds, of rhythms, of knowing what the words mean, making associations, trying to get pleasure without trying to think like, why, like Picasso, why is one breast up here and one breast is down here, Like, what did he mean by that? Does he mean he wants to dismember women? Or like, why is this like this? instead of trying to think, like, what did he mean, or what the author meant, or what is the truth here, start with the pleasure of surfaces, the pleasure of the sounds, the pleasure of the words, looking up words you don't know, trying to put things together, trying to parse your experience together, and then going and maybe, okay, this seems very postmodern. What's the deal here? Looking at the relationship between the title, the first lines, and word patterns, so the way we did with these. These are more realist poems in that way. Like we do know the subject, but I think the same technique as Matthew's basically walked us through with those 4 ideas. I mean, you'll add other stages to those stages, but the main thing is just try to keep poetry in your lives as a not inaccessible, so difficult that it's this little closed box and I can't get into it. And also, like, if you feel drawn to some of those techniques, I always say to my 102 students, like, have you thought in complete sentences lately when you go into the Safeway? You go over, like, I am going to go buy a bell pepper, and I am noticing that. I mean, the techniques of contemporary poetry are very much, a lot about disjunction, fragmentation, and those things that we actually do as part of our consciousness. So it's not really an alien force that's not already inside of you. Those mysteries already exist, and you're just tapping into them as you read poetry. So,
On a practical level, I just want to make sure that I leave with you with the most basic advice for reading poems, and it's advice I take for myself every time I read a poem, which is to ask myself to think about what I see there, and to try to go word by word and think about what's been put down on the page and what is there, and then ask myself if there's anything at all that seems strange to me about it, and then to genuinely ask the question about why it might be that way, either to myself or to the people around me. And that's all you need to do, either as a teacher or as a student. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to know anything. You just need to just ask and just start and stay with the poem. Don't jump ahead. Don't try to make a big idea. Don't try to come up with a big theme. Don't do that. Because that kind of thinking will come out of being with the choices made in the poem. And it'll be much more pleasurable and exciting and fun, rewarding to stay with what's there and go slow and do it together with other people. And that's true for the most advanced students, and it's true for beginning students, and it's true for the most advanced literature teachers and beginning literature teachers. So it's not hard to do it, it's just hard to remember to do it, is what I would say. But practice. And so you asked about what to do when you're faced in that rare circumstance of the poem that makes absolutely no sense and that's nothing or whatever. If you were to practice a lot with other kinds of poems, when you got to that poem, you'd probably have a lot of methods that would help you encounter it in an interesting way.
yeah.
That's my guess.
So maybe we'll, thank
Can
you
we
so much for
thank
coming
our
today.
speakers?
Thank you.
Before you scoot out, I'll repeat again that we're very interested in your feedback. You can take a moment now, we've stopped a little early. There should be a questionnaire in your inbox. If it hasn't come in yet, it will be sent to you. We really hope that you'll respond, and we can use that as evidence to persuade them to do this presentation again.
Give us an A.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for having us.
I definitely ran into that.
Vámonos.
I need to go. I guess you can really eat here. That would have been
Take that. Wait, do we have to